we're speaking about Colorado and Jenna Griswold and the stature or position that she's taken on this case. Contrast that with somebody like Brad Raffensperger, who has, I would say, in my opinion, extremely disappointingly come out in opposition to the notion of enforcing Section 3 in his position as Secretary of State. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last week. He claimed that it's not really his authority to do this and that it would be undemocratic and that the voters should be given the choice, of course, lest we all forget that the voters were given the choice in 2020 and Donald Trump tried to deprive them of that choice. But can you respond to this position that I think is deeply flawed of Brad Raffensperger, that he as Secretary of State is not in a position to remove Donald Trump properly from the ballot in accordance with the Constitution?
Well, he's in an awkward position. He is the one who, I think, quite rightly and thankfully resisted the strong arm techniques that Donald Trump tried to use in that infamous call, "Can't you just find me 11,280 votes?" He did his duty in that case. He refused to overturn the election. Now, having pretty much alienated lots of the MAGA voters, I think he is trying to preserve at least a thread of credibility with them by saying that he now favors what he calls democracy. Let the voters decide. But of course, as Judge Michael Ludig, with whom I wrote the piece together in the Atlantic Monthly, has pointed out several times, it's not democratic, quite apart from the undemocratic step that Donald Trump took in trying to overturn a democratic election. It's not democratic to close your eyes to part of the Constitution. The Constitution and the rule of law are the framework for the kind of democracy we have. And when it says someone isn't eligible, there's nothing undemocratic about excluding him. There was nothing undemocratic about excluding some of the 32-year-olds who have tried on various occasions to run for president. There would have been nothing undemocratic about excluding John McCain if it turned out that he wasn't a natural-born citizen. But in a memorandum I wrote for the late Senator McCain, together with Ted Olson, explained why, having been born in the Panama Canal Zone to American military individuals stationed there, qualified as a natural-born citizen. But there were lawsuits that were brought to keep him off the ballot. And if the law indicated that he wasn't a natural-born citizen, just being a hero and being a great man wouldn't have entitled him to be there, or being popular wouldn't have entitled him to be there. So democracy doesn't mean the same thing as popularity. It may be that Donald Trump, within his circle, is enormously popular, and he's going to give President Biden a run for his money. But that doesn't mean he's entitled to be on the ballot when he is ineligible under the disqualification clause.
Yeah, what you're mentioning about the, what we might call political dilemma of Brad Raffensperger kind of segues perfectly into the next subject I was going to raise with you, which is these challenges. I've read a number of these opinion pieces in the last week and challenging Section 3, and they largely boil down in my mind to the concept that we have Section 3 there for us to enforce, but we shouldn't use it because it's too politically fraught. One of the pieces by a Washington Post staff writer, Aaron Blake, asked the question, is it worth the blowback? Is it worth the blowback? And I couldn't help but be reminded of a sentiment that I have had for years, and I was so grateful to see you echo actually this weekend in another context, where you were basically saying that backbone begets respect. And I think you referenced something very similar in your Atlantic piece when you said appeasement triggers violence. I'm sorry, that was what you said this weekend. But in your Atlantic piece, you said the process that will play out over the coming year could give rise to momentary social unrest and even violence, but so could the failure to engage in this constitutionally mandated process. Aren't people who are afraid of political backlash or unrest in this moment from us exercising our constitutional duty being short-sighted as to the long-term effects of letting Donald Trump on the ballot and potentially abusing his constitutional duty again?
Well, I think they are being very short-sighted because it may be the case that appeasement is the path to tranquility momentarily. But in the long run, if we take those parts of the Constitution that we think are inconvenient to enforce or whose enforcement might cause backlash and then put them on the back burner, or worse still, shred them, or do what Donald Trump has said openly and explicitly that he would do, namely, he would trash those parts of the Constitution that got in his way. He said he would, I think his word wasn't just suspend, it was eliminate. I forgot the precise word he used, but
Terminate.
yes, he was going to terminate. Well, once we start terminating parts of the Constitution that don't work well for us at the moment, that's the ball game. I mean, then it's the strong man rules. It's might makes right. And some people who temporarily think they will not be the victims of the retribution that Donald Trump says he will bring, for one thing, they may be wrong. There may be a lot of victims. For another, you may not be his victim, but you'll be somebody else's. If you really want chaos, if you want a world without law, a world where the laws that are inconvenient are shredded, just think what that means. If you were a believer in the Second Amendment, for example, taking it seriously, you want to take it seriously. Well, there's a lot of debate about what is or is not a permissible firearms regulation. But if people say that the Second Amendment has outlived its utility, right? Too many people have died. So we don't have the votes to amend it out of the Constitution. Let's just erase it, pretend it's not there. Well, that would be pretty convenient. And for all the people who die in mass shootings in America, I know that that's a temptation, but you don't hear them saying, let's just shred the Second Amendment, let's get rid of it. I think once you start doing that, we are down a path that knows no end. And I just absolutely refuse to go in that direction. It also is not practical. I mean, if what you want is to avoid violence, the last thing you need is a president of the United States who foments violence, who has done it throughout his career. Whenever he has these rallies, he kind of encourages violence. We know what he does. He obviously encouraged violence against his own vice president on January 6th. So you really think you're going to get peace under this guy? It's both short-sighted, and even in the short run, it's rather foolish.
Before I let you go, Professor Tribe, I have to ask you, you've mentioned several times conservative judge Michael Luttig, and the two of you have come together to form this extremely dynamic duo. Such a powerful voice with the two of you on different ends of an ideological spectrum. I'm just curious how this collaboration came about.
Well, we've worked together on a great many things, because even though he's a very rock-ribbed Republican, and I'm quite a loyal, liberal, progressive Democrat, and we disagree about all kinds of contentious, substantive issues, we both agree and have long agreed on some core constitutional precepts. So, for example, he brought me on board as chief constitutional counsel for a private company, Coca-Cola, some years ago, which is involved in a constitutional wrestling match with the Internal Revenue Service. We have different views, I guess, of Coca-Cola, although I happen to like it. We have different views of abortion, affirmative action, you name it. But we both think the government should turn square corners. It should be fair. It should apply due process principles. And it should apply Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So we've become good friends over the years because we have seen things the same way when it comes to some really basic things. And I admire greatly the kind of judge he was. Thought he would have made a fine Supreme Court justice. He lost out to, I guess it was to Sam Alito at the time. I think he would have been a better justice. And so it's quite natural for us to work together on things where we agreed.
It's been an absolute pleasure to watch. And it's been a pleasure to have you today, Professor Tribe. Is there anything else that you would like to leave us with on Section 3 in this moment?
only that, Jessica, you've asked some great questions. They were penetrating. They weren't really softballs, although I think I have answers to them. And I admire what you're doing, and I hope people will take the whole Constitution seriously, because both it and the rule of law, and therefore our kind of democracy, are up for grabs right now.